A 2000 Ford Ranger 3-liter four-wheel drive has a problem with a high idle, or did have a problem with a high idle, and so this video is designed to help you solve those problems if you're also suffering from that. I want to mention before we get started that I'm a pastor and a Christian, and so if you get a chance, cruise over to my other pages. There's a lot more important things in life than trucks or high idles. So what I'd like to do as we begin is to walk you through exactly the critical components that make up the factors regarding idle. And so let's begin and walk through exactly how the air enters into the engine. So of course you have your air box, and right behind that is the first sensor that feeds data to the computer, called the mass airflow sensor, or MAF. And it measures the volume of air that is flowing through the intake into the engine. As we walk our way down the intake system, the next stop is going to be at this sensor, and this sensor measures the temperature of the intake air, because it matters exactly how hot or cold that air is, whether it's 20 degrees outside and the air you're pulling in is very cold, or if it's a hot summer day and the engine compartment has heated up well over 100 degrees. And so that's the job of that particular sensor. As you move to the throttle body, there's a number of components that are really critical here. The one on the side that's a little hard to capture is the throttle position sensor, TPS, right here on the side of the throttle body. And it actually measures exactly how much throttle is being applied as you depress the gas pedal, and sends that information to the computer so that it knows exactly the position that the throttle is being held at. On the top is the most important component. It is the idle air controller. And the idle air controller really serves as the heart of the whole intake system regarding idle. And so the way this works is that inside of the throttle body is a throttle plate with a small hole in it, so that mechanically there's air flowing always into the engine to keep it at idle. There's also on top this electronic component that is able to open and close an additional air pathway into the intake. And the reason for that is, as load is applied to the engine, the computer is aware of that load and adjusts the idle air control to maintain the proper idle speed. For example, if you're sitting at a stoplight and you turn on your air conditioner, that introduces a lot more load to the engine at idle. And so the computer is aware of that change, automatically sends the signal to this component, opening up that air pathway additionally, allowing more air to flow in, and the net of the idle is that it's unchanged. The operator of the vehicle never even notices. It also happens with power steering. So you're backing out of a parking space and you cut the wheel hard to the right to make the turn. That applies a lot of load on the engine, and the engine needs to have more power to accommodate that. The idle air controller takes care of that without you even knowing about it. Really important component. And we'll talk more about some of the problems that you may encounter with that component. I want to point out a couple other things. One really important is this screw here, which looks like an idle adjustment screw, but it is not, and you should never turn that screw. If you attempt to turn it, it will mechanically open and close the throttle plate. However, it does not adjust the throttle, because the computer is always compensating with the idle air controller. So adjusting this is only going to wreak havoc on you, and it is never supposed to be turned once it is set from the factory. Now, if you have turned this screw, we'll talk in a minute about how to bring that back into the proper place, or at least as close as possible. A couple other components that are super important on the system regarding idle would be this component, the ERG. It recirculates exhaust into the intake to help the motor run a little cooler and cleaner, and we'll talk about how that can fail sometimes. And then at the back, which I'm not able to show you just because it's kind of buried under the intake, it is down in there, is the Pcv valve. And so that is designed to pull clean air through the crankcase, also helping the engine to run cleaner and more efficiently. And then finally, the last item that can be of troublesome are all the vacuum lines that are associated with the intake. And so there are some that are large, like the one here for the brake booster, and then there's some that are very small like the one here on top of the ERG that is green in your picture right now. And so those are like a spider web throughout the engine compartment, even running into the cabin of the vehicle to control the air conditioning or the fan or the climate control, I should say, inside the cabin. So those can also be a problem. Now, if you're having a high idle, there's a lot of things to consider. So troubleshooting, especially for the home mechanic, can be a real challenge. And so let me walk you through some of the things you can do as a home mechanic that are simple and inexpensive that hopefully will address the problem that you may be having. So the first thing I would recommend doing would be to make a small purchase of this item here called a mini OBD2 scanner. I purchased this one from Amazon. It was about $12. It's actually this device here. And it plugs in under the dash, and it reads the computer of the vehicle, sending a Bluetooth signal to your cell phone. Now you'll need to purchase the corresponding app for your phone, and it is the one I purchased was by a company called Torque, and I bought Torque Pro. I think it was $5. So the complete investment is only about $20, and it allows for a multitude of options and information that you can read your vehicle, and it does work on any vehicle. Now I should say this is a really inexpensive version. They make more expensive versions, but so far I've had really good success with this one. So I'm able to read error codes, check engine lights, but most importantly I'm able to read the telemetry of the engine and many of the values of these sensors. So for instance, I'm able to read the value of the mass airflow sensor on my cell phone. And I am able to evaluate those based on perhaps information off the internet to see if they're operating within parameters. Now, if the mass airflow sensor is out of parameters, or if you just wanted to, it's very easy to clean. So you can just simply take off these two screws, pull the unit out, and using mass airflow cleaner, which you can purchase at any parts department or store, you just can spray it off. And if it's dirty, it can make a profound difference in the idling of the vehicle because it's giving misinformation to the computer, leading to a wrong mixture of fuel air. So that's a really easy one. You can also read this sensor, and it will tell you exactly the temperature of the air intake, and that's just a sanity check because if it's reading that the air intake is -5 degrees and it's 80 degrees outside, this sensor is faulty, and you can then replace it and move on your way. The same is true of the throttle position. You can evaluate whether that is operating properly. Now, you should be aware on Ford Rangers, I believe that the computer adjusts for the readings of the throttle position sensor. So, for instance, on this one, at idle, I think it reads at 26%, at wide open throttle, 95%. But those values are a bit arbitrary. Once the computer understands that that's idle and wide open throttle, it then adjusts and understands that information. But nonetheless, I can evaluate whether it's operating, whether it's sticking, and at least get some information on that particular item. I can also read on my phone the actual idle of the engine, because I noticed with this truck that the actual gauge is a little bit off, and mine actually reads a little higher than it's supposed to on the gauge. So I was reading, say, 1,000 or 1,050, when in reality the idle wasn't nearly that high. It was actually a little lower than that. My gauge was just off, and so that was also very helpful information. Also on the Torque app, I can also read vacuum values, and so I can determine whether I have a vacuum leak, at least in part, by reading the vacuum values as I drive the vehicle. So if I'm going to troubleshoot this, one of the first things I can do is I can use that Torque app along with the Bluetooth device to get some information without spending any additional money. Now, here's a couple of other tips that you may find very helpful. I've already told you how to clean the mass airflow sensor. You can also clean this sensor with mass airflow cleaner as well. It's an electronic device. Now, let's come over here to the air idle controller. This frequently sticks. Carbon builds up inside of it, and it will hang. And so what happens is it never goes to the position desired by the computer, and so it leaves the airway more open than it should be, causing a high idle. It's mounted on by two screws. You can see from the top, one on each side. You can simply remove that, and using carb or choke cleaner, you can clean that very, very easily, and it's likely to make a profound difference in the idle. So I highly recommend that. That's a $5 step and would be very easy to do. Now, the same is true of the throttle body. You can clean the inside of the throttle body by removing this screw the air hose, and then 4 bolts that are located in the perimeter of the throttle body. And so you can remove those, you can unhook this throttle cable, unplug things, pretty simple, and physically clean the throttle plate inside. Now be aware that for many Fords, especially Ford Rangers, the throttle plate is coated with a Teflon coating to prevent carbon buildup. It works pretty well, but there still may be carbon buildup. If you use carbon choke cleaner, you will remove that coating, which is not something you want to do. So hot soapy water, fine. A good clean rag is fine. But if that throttle plate is sticking open, it will also cause a high idle situation. And that also is basically a free maintenance item that you can do. Okay, a couple other things that you can do to deal with a high idle if those have not repaired the problem. You can begin looking for a vacuum leak, which is very, very common in all vehicles, because if there's a vacuum leak in any of those hoses that make their way around the engine compartment or even inside the cabin, then what happens is you end up with extra air that's unaccounted for by the mass airflow sensor because it never read it. And so it increases the idle and can create a problem. Now, how do I know if I have a vacuum leak? There's a couple of things you can look for. One was with the torque device on your phone. That may give you some information. You can also put your vehicle in air conditioning mode where it's coming out of the vents. So I want the air conditioning to be coming out of the standard vents. And you want to drive the vehicle and apply some load at speed. So say 45, 50 miles an hour, find a hill, and try to accelerate up the hill. Now, if there's a substantial vacuum leak, the vacuum pressure inside of the system will drop, and inside of the cabin, it will automatically move from the air flowing from the vents to the air flowing out of the defrost. Now, obviously, the knob is not going to move, but the actual air is going to move because it's vacuum pressure that holds the baffle in place and maintains the air coming out of the vents. So if you lose vacuum pressure, it can't do that anymore, and all of a sudden you have air flowing out of the defrost. That's the sure sign that you have a vacuum leak in your system. Now, once you've identified that there is a vacuum leak, finding it can be really, really difficult. And so you can go through and manually or visually look and even replace vacuum lines one at a time, hopefully finding the part that is leaking. That can be very tedious. Some people recommend using carburetor cleaner. You can find this recommended on a bunch of places on the internet, but I can tell you now that the risk of causing a fire using carburetor cleaner was too much for me, and so I didn't want to try that. I was very nervous about spraying carburetor cleaner trying to find a vacuum leak while my car is running. So what I did was something that was also very helpful but much safer. Is I built a simple smoke machine made out of a couple of items here. An orange juice container, vacuum line, a cigar, which is down in there, but it's all burned up. It used to stick down into the orange juice container. And a nebulizer pump, an aquarium pump would work as well. So what I did was I simply, using the nebulizer, pumped air into the bottom of this orange juice container. I had previously lit the cigar, and it is attached to the tube inside of here, and then I attached this vacuum hose into the intake right using this vacuum line here. Right on that, right up in there. And I just let it sit there. It's low pressure, so I'm not going to damage anything. The cigar is producing lots of thick smoke. And I'm just looking to see where is smoke coming out of the engine. You know, what vacuum line is leaking air. Now, I wouldn't want to use compressed air from, say, like a compressor, 40, 50, 60 psi. That could create all kinds of problems. But with a nebulizer pump, the pressure is so low, I'm not going to damage anything to my knowledge. And I began to notice that there was smoke coming out of this ERG valve. So I was actually leaking air here straight into the intake. That was creating some of the high idle problem. And so nonetheless, these are all the systems that can, or components that can cause high idles. You should be able to walk through these different items with these tips and hopefully find the one that's creating your problem. if you have turned this screw here, this idle screw, it can be difficult to get it back in place. What I did was I simply, using my hand, you can tell when the throttle plate is being stopped on the stop. If I were to loosen this, I can tell when the throttle plate is actually hitting inside. And this should operate as a stop so that the throttle plate is not constantly being rubbed up against the inside of the throttle body. And so what I did is I simply adjusted this so that it just began to use this stop as the stop rather than inside the throttle plate. That gives me the minimum amount of opening in the throttle plate and allow the system to work to its full potential. I found that to be a good method. There are some other methods, but I found that one for me personally worked really, really well. So I hope these items were helpful to you. Hope you're able to find your problem with your high idle. And again, I want to remind you that I'm a pastor and a Christian. A lot more important things in life than a high idling engine or a pickup truck. So if you get a chance, cruise over to my other videos and take a peek. Thank you and God bless.